The Gilded Fawn. The Gilded Fawn wasn't just a restaurant, it was a monument to excess, perched high above the neon-drenched cityscape of Cerelia Prime. Chandeliers made from crystallized tears of dying stars cast rainbow prisms across tables carved from extinct planetary cores. The air itself was imported from worlds that no longer existed, filtered through systems that cost more than most civilizations' entire GDP. Eevee Carter wiped down her serving tray with mechanical precision, her human hand steady despite the chaos around her. She'd been working here for 3 months, long enough to know that the clientele weren't just wealthy, they were the kind of beings who owned entire solar systems as vacation homes. Dragons, AI overlords, alien merchants with more arms than morals, and creatures she couldn't even pronounce, let alone understand. But money was money, and her rent on the lower levels wasn't going to pay itself. Tonight felt different, though. The usual hum of barely concealed hostility between species had sharpened into something almost electric. At the center of it all sat Varx the Indomitable, whose very presence seemed to bend reality around him. The dragon's scales were the color of molten gold, each one worth more than most planets' annual tax revenue. His custom-tailored vest, woven from silk that allegedly came from interdimensional creatures, stretched across a frame that had crushed star fleets with casual indifference. Across from him sat his son, Kor. Where Varx commanded attention through sheer gravitational force, Kor seemed to fold in on himself. His golden scales were duller, his wings smaller, his entire presence a whispered apology for existing. The news feeds called it genetic deviation, but Eevee had grown up in the slums of Earth's dying cities. She knew what bullying looked like, no matter how many fancy words you wrapped around it. "This is a waste of time," Varx rumbled, his voice making the molecular-balanced cutlery tremble. "The boy must learn to assert himself." Kor hunched further over his plate, a meteoric steak that had supposedly been aged in vacuum for a century. He made no move to eat it, his small claws gripping the table edge like it might anchor him to reality. Eevee had seen enough. She'd grown up watching her younger brother get picked on by bigger kids, and the size of the bully had never mattered to her. Rich, poor, human, or dragon, cruelty was cruelty. She approached the table carrying a bowl of venom-green burst salad, her footsteps steady despite the fact that she was walking toward a being who could erase her from existence with a thought. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade as she got closer, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Setting the bowl down, she looked at Kor's untouched meal, then at the young dragon's miserable expression. Without thinking, she reached forward and held up a small portion of the salad toward him. "Here," she said simply. "Try this." The Gilded Fawn fell into absolute silence. At the far end of the restaurant, a four-armed ambassador stopped mid-toast, its multiple mouths hanging open. A holographic AI investor temporarily paused its stock manipulation algorithms. Even the restaurant's automated drones, programmed with strict non-intervention policies, hovered closer as if unsure whether they needed to record this for insurance purposes. Varx's molten gold eyes locked onto Eevee with a stare that had previously convinced planetary monarchs to abdicate their thrones out of sheer terror. "You would feed him like a hatchling," he rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of collapsing stars. "Yeah," Eevee replied, undeterred. "Because he's acting like one. So either he eats, or you get over yourself and let the kid enjoy his dinner in peace." An entire warship's worth of diplomacy advisors, had they been present, would have collectively suffered aneurysms at this moment. Kor, stunned by the sheer blasphemy of being treated like a person instead of a disappointment, hesitated. He could feel the weight of his father's empire-spanning disappointment pressing down on him like an incoming asteroid strike. And then he did something unprecedented. He took the bite. A sharp inhalation rippled across the restaurant. The nearest merchant fainted onto his platter of gold-dusted caviar. Somewhere in the quantum networks, news algorithms began adjusting their trending topics in real time. Varx, immovable force of capitalist dominion, twitched. "You are not a nanny," he growled at Eevee, his voice capable of cracking asteroids. "You are not his keeper." "Cool," she said, arms crossed. But you sure as hell aren't acting like his dad. Core, for the first time in his isolated, publicly scrutinized existence, laughed. A small laugh, hesitant as if testing the air, unsure if humor was even an allowed function of his genetics. And that laugh broke something in Varx that had been rigid for centuries. He had won wars over less. He had burned civilizations to the ground for daring to disrespect him. And yet here, in this absurd, ridiculous moment, he had been undone by a human waitress with zero regard for intergalactic social order. "You have no idea what you've just done," he finally said, studying Eevee as if she were a previously undiscovered alien species with an irritating talent for not dying. Eevee shrugged. "Pretty sure I just made sure your kid eats his vegetables." "You're welcome." And with that, she turned and walked away, completely unaware that she had just kicked over the first domino in what would become an intergalactic crisis of unprecedented scale. Because Varx the Indomitable was not a creature accustomed to losing, and if he had just lost, then the entire balance of power in the known universe was about to shift forever. Imperial consequences. Varx the Indomitable did not react immediately. That, in itself, was a terrifying omen. The universe was accustomed to predictable responses from creatures like him, swift, merciless strikes that would be whispered about across sectors for decades. Entire planets had been glassed for lesser slights. But here he was, staring at the remnants of his son's half-eaten salad, his massive claws tightening around his goblet of liquid platinum until the metal warped. This was new territory. Eevee Carter, oblivious to the seismic event she had just triggered in the galactic power structure, was already moving on. She took orders from a table of off-world cybernetic investors who spoke in binary and passive aggression, completely unaware that she had just humiliated one of the most powerful beings in known space. Core, however, had noticed. For the first time in his socially exiled existence, he had done something against protocol and survived. He had laughed in the presence of his father and he was still breathing. That was profoundly unsettling, like waking up one day to find that gravity had decided it was tired and was considering quitting. Part of him, the part engineered through centuries of genetic supremacy doctrine, expected retribution. A swift correction. A fiery end. Instead, Varx simply rose from the table and walked away. Core blinked, then blinked again. Dragons didn't walk away from conflict, especially not this dragon. Exactly 7 hours later, the first sign that something was deeply, catastrophically wrong was the sudden spike in classified hyperspace activity near Cerelia Prime. The second was the arrival of an Imperial fleet, fully armed and fully operational, parked directly outside the Gilded Fawn like a particularly aggressive restaurant review. The third sign was the arrival of Varx's lawyers. Technically, they weren't just lawyers. They were strategic asset recovery specialists, a polite way of saying beings who made problems disappear using methods that violated several universal treaties. They moved through the restaurant like a plague of well-dressed locusts, their briefcases containing documents that could legally erase entire species from existence. "Ma'am," the lead specialist said to Eevee, his voice carrying the kind of artificial politeness that preceded civilizations being audited into extinction. "You are hereby summoned to appear before the Draconic Council of Zorak Prime to answer for crimes against imperial dignity, disruption of hierarchical order, and," he consulted his tablet, "unlawful intervention in paternal disciplinary procedures." Eevee, who had been balancing 3 plates of bioluminescent seafood on her arm, set them down carefully. "I'm sorry, what now?" "You have been accused of assault against a member of the sovereign ruling class," the specialist continued, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he was discussing legal charges that carried penalties ranging from complete molecular dissolution to being fed to a star. "The incident has been classified as an act of interspecies terrorism." "I gave the kid a bite of salad," Eevee said flatly. "Yes, ma'am. Unlawful feeding of a sovereign heir without parental consent. It's a Class 7 felony in 43 star systems." The restaurant, which had been buzzing with the kind of nervous energy that followed cosmic incidents, fell silent again. This was the part where normal people would panic, or grovel, or attempt to flee to a non-extradition planet. Instead, Eevee did something that would later be studied in xenopsychology courses across the galaxy. She laughed. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I helped a kid eat his vegetables, and now you're threatening me with what sounds like a death sentence. Ma'am, I would strongly advise you to take this matter seriously." "Oh, I'm taking it seriously," Eevee interrupted. "I'm seriously wondering how an entire galactic empire can be run by beings who think showing basic kindness to a child is a crime." The lead specialist's expression shifted from professional politeness to something approaching confusion. In his extensive experience with interplanetary legal intimidation, the targets usually either collapsed into terrified compliance or attempted to bargain for their lives. They did not, as a rule, critique the fundamental moral structure of the empire. "Ma'am, you will comply with this summons or face immediate detention." "Or what?" Eevee asked, crossing her arms. "You'll do what your boss didn't have the guts to do himself. Because last I checked, he walked away from that table like a scared child." The silence that followed was the kind that preceded supernovas. Across the restaurant, beings who had lived for millennia and survived the rise and fall of civilizations began quietly calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Even the automated drones started uploading their consciousness to backup servers. Because insulting Varx the Indomitable once might have been dismissed as ignorance or temporary insanity. But doing it twice, to his official representatives, in front of witnesses? That was the kind of thing that started wars. The specialist's tablet chimed softly. He glanced at it, and his artificially perfect composure cracked just slightly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been genuine concern, "I have just received word that Lord Varx has personally requested your immediate transport to his flagship. This is not a request that has ever been made before." Eevee looked around the restaurant, at the faces of beings who treated the movement of planets as casual investment opportunities, all of them staring at her with mixtures of horror and fascination. She thought about Kor, hunched over his untouched meal, and about the small, hesitant laugh that had broken something in his father. "Fine," she said, untying her apron. "But I'm not changing out of my uniform. If he wants to threaten me over vegetables, he can do it while I'm dressed for work." As she walked toward the exit, escorted by beings whose job descriptions included making star systems comply through creative interpretation of physics, she couldn't help but wonder if she was about to become a footnote in galactic history. She had no idea that she was about to become the prologue to a revolution. The Reckoning. The flagship sovereign's pride was less a ship and more a mobile monument to the concept of too much. Its hull was forged from the compressed cores of dead stars, its corridors wide enough to accommodate beings the size of small moons. The walls were lined with the preserved scales of every dragon who had ever challenged Varx's authority, a subtle reminder that the ship's owner had never lost a fight. Until now. Eevee was escorted through corridors that stretched for what felt like miles, past viewports that showed a universe of stars that belonged to the being she had just insulted. Twice. The guards flanking her were silent, their faces hidden behind masks that probably cost more than Earth's entire economy. She tried not to think about the fact that she was about to confront a creature who could turn planets into decorative glass sculptures when he was in a bad mood. The throne room, because of course it was a throne room, was a cathedral of intimidation. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, supported by pillars carved from the bones of creatures that had gone extinct before humans had discovered fire. At the center of it all sat Varx the Indomitable, looking exactly like what he was, a dragon who had never been told no in his entire existence. Until today. "Leave us," he commanded, his voice echoing through the chamber like distant thunder. The guards hesitated. In the history of the Zorak Empire, civilians were not left alone with the Emperor. It was a safety protocol written in the blood of the last person who had tried it. "I said leave us," Varx repeated, and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. The guards filed out, sealing the massive doors behind them. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impending violence, or at least the threat of it. Eevee stood in the center of the vast chamber, her server's uniform ridiculously out of place among the cosmic grandeur. She looked up at the dragon who could end her existence with a thought, and did something that would later be recorded in the annals of galactic history. She yawned. "Look," she said, checking an imaginary watch on her wrist, "I've got a shift tomorrow morning, so if you're planning to do something dramatic, can we speed this up? I need at least 6 hours of sleep or I get cranky." Varx stared at her for a long moment, his golden eyes reflecting the light from stars that served as his personal illumination. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she expected. "Do you know what you've done? Fed your kid some vegetables. You embarrassed me," he said, and for the first time, she heard something other than imperial authority in his voice. "In front of beings who have waited centuries for a sign of weakness. You made me look like a fool." "No," Eevee said, surprising herself with her own boldness. "You made yourself look like a fool. I just gave your son a bite of salad. He is not meant to be coddled. He is meant to be strong. He's meant to be happy," she shot back. "He's a kid. Your kid. And instead of helping him figure out how to be himself, you're trying to turn him into a copy of you. I am trying to prepare him for a universe that will destroy him if he shows weakness. By destroying him first." Eevee stepped closer, and several monitoring systems around the throne room registered threat levels that had never been calculated before. "By making him so scared of disappointing you that he can't even eat a meal without panicking." Varx's claws extended, scraping against the armrests of his throne. "You do not understand our ways, human. You do not understand what it means to rule." "Maybe not," Eevee admitted. "But I understand what it means to be a kid who's scared of their parent. And I understand what it means to watch someone you love disappear because they're too afraid to be themselves." The reference to love hit something in Varx that his cosmic empire had never touched. He had conquered galaxies, had built an empire spanning dimensions, had accumulated wealth that could buy and sell entire species. But when was the last time he had thought about love? "He is weak," Varx said, but the words lacked the conviction they had carried in the restaurant. "He's different," Eevee corrected. "And maybe that's exactly what your empire needs. Someone who thinks before they incinerate. Someone who considers before they conquer. Someone who remembers that power isn't just about being the biggest, scariest thing in the room. The universe does not reward kindness, human. Doesn't it?" Eevee gestured around the throne room. "You've got all this power, all this wealth, all this fear. And you're sitting here alone, arguing with a waitress about whether it's okay to be nice to your own son. That sound like a reward to you?" Varx was quiet for a long moment. Outside the viewport, his fleet hung in space like a constellation of destruction, ready to reduce entire civilizations to cosmic dust at his command. Inside the throne room, a human woman in a stained apron was asking him to reconsider everything he had built his existence around. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally. "Try being his dad instead of his emperor," Eevee said simply. "Try seeing him as core, not as a disappointment. Try remembering that the strongest thing you can do sometimes is admit you were wrong." The dragon who had never apologized for anything in his millennia of existence looked at this small human and felt something crack in his chest. It wasn't his heart, dragons didn't have hearts in the traditional sense. But it was whatever passed for one in a being who had spent centuries turning emotions into strategic advantages. "You realize," he said quietly, "that if I follow your advice, it will be seen as weakness. There are beings who have waited eons for a sign that I am not invincible." "Then let them see," Eevee said. "Let them see that you're strong enough to change. Let them see that you're powerful enough to choose love over fear. And let them see that the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't a dragon with an empire. What is it then? A parent who gives a damn about their kid." For the first time in his existence, Varx the Indomitable smiled. It was a small smile, hesitant and uncertain, but it transformed his entire face. He looked less like a cosmic tyrant and more like a father who had just realized he had been making a terrible mistake. "Perhaps," he said, "it is time for me to learn something new. Unlikely alliances. The news that Varx the Indomitable had not immediately vaporized the human waitress traveled through the galaxy's information networks faster than light itself. By the time Eevee was escorted back to Cerealia Prime, the story had already mutated into 17 different versions, each more apocalyptic than the last. In the version favored by the Galactic Stock Exchange, Varx had been compromised by human mind control technology. In the version spreading through the Outer Rim territories, he had been replaced by a shape-shifting alien duplicate. In the version that the Zorak Empire's own propaganda ministry was frantically trying to suppress, he had been defeated in single combat by a being who weighed less than his left claw. None of these versions were correct, but they all shared one common thread: the invincible Dragon Emperor had shown weakness, and the universe was holding its breath to see what would happen next. The first sign that the cosmic order was shifting came when Kor appeared at the Gilded Fong 3 days later, alone. He had never been anywhere alone in his entire existence. Dragon heirs of the Zorak Empire traveled with entourages that included bodyguards, advisors, food tasters, and beings whose entire job was to ensure that the heir never encountered anything that might challenge their worldview. But here he was, standing awkwardly in the restaurant's entrance, looking like he had no idea what to do with his hands. "Is Eevee working today?" he asked the maitre d', who was having what might charitably be described as a complete existential crisis. Yes, sir. Your Imperial Highness, she's, table 7, the maitre d' managed, gesturing toward the dining area with a hand that trembled like a leaf in a hurricane. Kor nodded and walked into the restaurant proper, his smaller wings folded tight against his back. Conversation stopped as he passed, beings who had been discussing the overthrow of governments suddenly finding their drinks fascinating. He found Eevee refilling water glasses at a table of Andromedan diplomats, her movements as efficient and unimpressed as ever. She looked up as he approached, and her face broke into the kind of smile that had probably never been directed at a member of the Zorak royal family. "Hey, kid," she said, as if addressing a dragon prince in a restaurant was the most normal thing in the world. "You want your usual table?" Yes, Kor said, surprised to discover that he apparently had a usual table. "But I wanted to ask you something first." Eevee set down her water pitcher and gave him her full attention. It was such a simple gesture, but Kor couldn't remember the last time an adult had done it. Usually, beings either ignored him entirely or treated him like a potential threat to be managed. "What's up?" "My father," Kor said carefully, "has been different. Since the other night. He's been asking me questions." "What kind of questions?" "About what I want. About what I think. About." Kor hesitated, as if the words were dangerous. "About whether I'm happy." Eevee felt something warm and complicated twist in her chest. "And what did you tell him?" "That I don't know," Kor admitted. "I've never been asked that before." "Well," Eevee said, pulling out a chair at the nearest empty table, "want to figure it out?" For the next hour, Kor experienced something that no amount of genetic engineering or royal education had prepared him for, a normal conversation with someone who saw him as a person rather than a political asset. They talked about food, about the strange customs of different species, about the view from the restaurant's windows. They talked about everything except empires and conquest and the weight of hereditary expectations. It was, Kor decided, the best hour of his life. They were interrupted by the arrival of a being that made the restaurant's usual collection of cosmic criminals look like a kindergarten class. Admiral Thane, commander of the rebellion fleet and Varx's oldest enemy, walked through the Gilded Fong's doors like he owned the place. Which, given the recent upheaval in galactic politics, he might actually have. Thane was a Kethran, a species that looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a nightmare and then given the result strategic planning capabilities. His exoskeleton was scarred from 1,000 battles, and his 4 arms moved with the kind of precision that suggested he had personally killed more beings than most people had met. He approached Kor's table with the confidence of someone who had never lost a war, his compound eyes fixed on the young dragon with predatory interest. "Your Imperial Highness," he said, his voice carrying the kind of mock politeness that preceded assassinations. "How convenient to find you here. Unguarded." Vulnerable. Kor froze, his limited combat training flooding back in a cascade of panic. This was it. This was how he would die, murdered in a restaurant by his father's greatest enemy while a human waitress looked on in horror. Eevee, however, had different ideas. "Excuse me," she said, stepping between Thane and Kor with the kind of casual authority that suggested she had been dealing with difficult customers her entire life. "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. This is a family restaurant." Thane's compound eyes swiveled to focus on her, and several of his arms twitched toward weapons that could have carved through starship hulls. "You dare." "I dare to ask you to be polite," Eevee interrupted. "You want to have a conversation with the kid, that's fine. You want to make threats in my section, that's not fine. So what's it going to be?" The restaurant had gone dead silent. Even the automated drones had stopped moving, their sensors overloaded by the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing. A human waitress was lecturing Admiral Thane, the being who had held the Zorak Empire's expansion in check for 3 centuries. And Admiral Thane was listening. "You," he said slowly, "are the human who humiliated Varx the Indomitable." "I'm the human who helped his kid eat vegetables," Eevee corrected. "And right now, I'm the human who's asking you to either order something or leave." Thane studied her for a long moment, then did something that would later be analyzed by military strategists across the galaxy. He laughed. "I see," he said, "why you have caused such chaos." He turned to Kor, but his posture had shifted from threatening to merely curious. "Tell me, young prince, what do you think of your father's empire?" Kor, still processing the fact that he wasn't about to be murdered, took a shaky breath. "I think," he said quietly, "that it's very big." "Indeed it is. And do you plan to inherit it?" Kor glanced at Eevee, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I don't know if I want to." The admission hung in the air like a live grenade. Admitting doubt about imperial succession was the kind of thing that started civil wars. But instead of drawing weapons, Thane simply nodded. "Good," he said. "Empires built on conquest rarely survive being inherited by beings with consciences." He turned back to Eevee. "I believe I will have lunch after all. What would you recommend?" As Eevee led the galaxy's most dangerous rebel to a table and began explaining the day's specials, Kor realized that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. But for the first time in his existence, complicated felt like progress. Because if a human waitress could make peace between a dragon prince and a rebel admiral over lunch, then maybe the universe was ready for a different kind of conversation altogether. The New Order. 6 months after the incident that galactic historians would later call the salad herd round the universe, the Gilded Fong had become the most unlikely diplomatic venue in known space. What had started as a simple conversation between a waitress and a dragon prince had evolved into something that defied every rule of intergalactic politics. The restaurant now hosted what the media had dubbed the lunch accords, informal meetings between beings who had previously communicated only through acts of mutual annihilation. Rebel leaders shared appetizers with imperial governors. Trade disputes were resolved over dessert. A territorial war that had raged for 3 centuries was ended when both sides discovered they actually quite liked the same wine. At the center of it all was Eevee Carter, who had somehow become the galaxy's most effective diplomat without ever applying for the job. "I don't understand why you keep calling it diplomacy," she said to Kor, who was helping her set up chairs for the afternoon session. "I'm just making sure everyone eats their vegetables and plays nice." Kor, who had grown noticeably more confident over the past months, smiled. "Perhaps that's what diplomacy should be." The young dragon had changed. His scales had brightened, his wings had strengthened, and he had developed an annoying habit of asking questions that made the Empire's advisors uncomfortable. Questions like, "Why do we need to own that planet?" and "What if we tried asking nicely first?" His father had changed too. Varx the Indomitable entered the restaurant with his usual entourage, but the dynamic had shifted. Where once his approach had been met with terrified silence, now beings actually approached him voluntarily. They still feared him, you didn't rule a galactic empire without inspiring a healthy amount of terror, but they also respected him in a way that was entirely new. Eevee, he said, nodding to the waitress who had somehow become the closest thing he had to a friend, I trust today's session will be as productive as the last. Depends on whether Admiral Thane and Governor Kess can agree on the seating arrangements without starting a war, she replied, wiping down a table. They're both convinced the other one got the better view last time. I could have them both executed for their pettiness, Varx suggested, though his tone suggested he was joking. Probably. Or, Eevee said, you could let them work it out themselves. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to let people figure out they're being ridiculous. It was a philosophy that had somehow transformed galactic politics. Instead of imposing solutions through force, the new approach encouraged beings to find common ground. Instead of ruling through fear, leaders were expected to actually listen to their subjects. Instead of conquest, there was cooperation. It shouldn't have worked. Every political scientist in the galaxy had written extensively about why it couldn't work. But somehow, it did. Father, Kor said, approaching their table, the Andromedan delegation is here. They're ready to discuss the mining rights. Excellent, Varx said, then paused. What do you think of their proposal? It was such a simple question, but it represented a fundamental shift in how the Empire operated. Kor's opinions mattered now. His gentleness, his empathy, his tendency to consider the consequences of actions, traits that had once been seen as weaknesses, were now valued as strengths. I think, Kor said carefully, that we should ask the Andromedans what they actually need, instead of assuming we know what's best for them. Varx nodded approvingly. Wise. Handle the negotiations, but consult with me before making any final decisions. Kor's eyes widened. You want me to lead the negotiations? You have shown remarkable insight in these matters, his father said. It is time you took on more responsibility. As Kor walked away to meet with the delegation, his posture straight and confident, Eevee felt a surge of pride. The scared young dragon who had been afraid to eat his dinner had become a leader who genuinely cared about doing the right thing. You know, she said to Varx, I think you're getting the hang of this whole parenting thing. I had an excellent teacher, he replied, and for once, there was no imperial authority in his voice. Just gratitude. The afternoon session proceeded with the kind of efficiency that had made the lunch accords famous throughout the galaxy. Territorial disputes were resolved through creative compromise. Trade agreements were negotiated with an eye toward mutual benefit rather than exploitation. A brewing conflict between two species was diffused when they discovered they shared similar cultural values about family. Admiral Thane, who had become something of a regular, approached Eevee as she was cleaning up. I wanted to thank you, he said, his scarred exoskeleton gleaming in the restaurant's ambient light. For what? For proving that change is possible, he said. I spent 3 centuries fighting against the Empire because I believed it could never be reformed. You showed me that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply treating people with kindness. Eevee smiled. Don't get too sentimental on me, Admiral. You'll ruin your reputation. Perhaps, he said, some reputations are worth ruining. As the day wound down and the last of the delegates departed, Eevee found herself alone with Varx and Kor, sharing a quiet meal in the restaurant that had become the unofficial center of galactic governance. I've been thinking, Kor said, poking at his salad with genuine appetite, about what comes next. What do you mean? Eevee asked. The Empire is changing. We're not conquering anymore, we're cooperating. We're not ruling through fear, we're leading through example. But what does that make us? Varx considered the question. Perhaps, he said slowly, it makes us something new. Something better. A commonwealth, Kor suggested. A federation of worlds working together instead of being forced to submit. That, Varx said, is either the most brilliant idea in galactic history or the most naive. Maybe both, Eevee said. But sometimes the naive ideas are the ones that actually work. Over the following months, the transformation accelerated. The Zorak Empire formally dissolved itself, replaced by the Galactic Commonwealth, a voluntary association of worlds united by shared values rather than military might. Varx retained his position as leader, but his title changed from emperor to first speaker, and his role shifted from conqueror to coordinator. Kor was appointed as the Commonwealth's first ambassador for diplomatic innovation, a position that involved traveling the galaxy and helping other species resolve their conflicts through conversation rather than combat. He was remarkably good at it, his natural empathy and hard-won wisdom making him the kind of leader that beings actually wanted to follow. And Eevee Carter, the human waitress who had started it all, became the director of interspecies relations, though she insisted on keeping her serving uniform as her official outfit. "It reminds me where I came from," she explained to a reporter from the Galactic News Network. "And it reminds everyone else that sometimes the most important conversations happen over a shared meal." The interview was broadcast across the galaxy, reaching billions of beings who had lived their entire lives under the assumption that change was impossible. It gave them hope that maybe, just maybe, the universe could be a kinder place. Not everyone was pleased with the new order. There were still beings who preferred the old ways, who saw compassion as weakness and cooperation as surrender. But they found themselves increasingly outnumbered by those who had discovered that building something together was more satisfying than tearing it down alone. Years later, when historians tried to pinpoint the exact moment when the galaxy changed, they would point to the night when a human waitress decided to help a dragon prince eat his vegetables. They would write about the power of simple kindness, about the courage it takes to see past surface differences, about the revolutionary idea that treating people with dignity might actually be the most practical approach to governance. But for Eevee Carter, the moment that mattered most was much simpler. It was the day when Kor, now a confident young leader making decisions that affected entire civilizations, stopped by the Gilded Fawn just to say hello. "How are you doing, kid?" she asked, as she had so many times before. "Happy," he said, and meant it. "I'm really, truly happy." And that, she decided, was worth more than all the empires in the universe. The end.